Really appreciate you all turning out today. Today we're going to be doing a couple of different things. First of all, I will be talking a little bit about what makes good characters. Because one of the things that I love doing at these book launch events is sort of sharing some of the things that I've learned in my writing and the things that I enjoy about story with all of you. Because I always think it's interesting to hear about how different people tackle stories. Then I'll be reading the first chapter from the Heist and telling you a little bit about it. And then we will be moving into a little bit of Q&A, so you can ask some questions about anything that I've talked about or about the book or whatever. And then after that we will be having some book sales where you can come up and get a copy if you want. I'll also be signing them here too. A couple of quick housekeeping things. If you need to use the bathrooms, they're just down this corridor here and then at the left. You're more than welcome to dig into the food. We've got a lot there, so that needs to go. And apart from that, I think that should be it. So, characters. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that characters are the things that I enjoy the most about stories. You know, you can have great plots that keep people riveted on what's happening in your narrative, and you can have suspense that pulls people through, and interesting worlds that make people amazed. But I find that when you close the pages of the book, it is the characters that stay with you, and they're the thing that you keep remembering back to about the books that you've read or the movies you've watched. So, for me, I've kind of boiled it down to four main things that I think create really good characters. The first one of those are goals. So if you compare two different characters in a narrative, and one is just sort of living their life, not really doing anything, going through the motions, and you compare that to another character who really desperately wants something and is willing to sacrifice things and change to get it, which one is going to be more interesting out of those two? It's usually going to be the person who has a strong drive to perform some action in the story, to change the world, to change other characters. So I think that whenever I'm writing characters, I always try to make sure that all of the people in my story have something that they want. It could be something small, like they just want a glass of water, or it could be something big, like they are angry with how the world is and they want to change that. And people are usually pretty good at figuring this out for their main character, but it can get a lot more tricky for the secondary characters and the people who play a more minor role in the story. However, I think that's where this idea of having goals really comes into full fruition, is when everyone in your story has these things that they want, and the competition between these different desires creates conflict in the narrative. The second thing is this idea of contradiction leading to complexity. So, just wait for the train to go past. Good initiative. Cheers, mate. So, have we all heard this idea of three-dimensional characters before? Can you put up your hands if you've heard that before? Yeah? Yeah, so a couple people? Cool. So, we're often told that you need to make your characters three-dimensional, you need to make them lifelike. But what does that actually mean? I think if we consider a one-dimensional character, it's a character who only really has one aspect to their personality. Three-dimensional characters have multiple, oftentimes competing things that are going on within their psyche. And this leads to conflict as they are struggling to integrate these different parts of their personality. So, to give you an example, my favourite villain at the moment in all of the different books and movies that I'm watching is Homelander from The Boys. I'm not sure if anyone has seen that. Actually, put up your hands if you've seen The Boys at all. Yeah, a couple of people? Cool. So, if you don't know who Homelander is, I'll try to describe him without giving massive spoilers. But basically, he's Superman who is also sort of narcissistic and evil. And what I find so fascinating about his personality and his characterization is he just has all of these contradictions bouncing around in his head. He has this kind of like very clean-cut, charming facade that he presents to the world, but then when the cameras are off and he's behind closed doors, he is absolutely ruthless and just a horrible person to so many people. And that disparity between his characteristics in different situations really leads to a lot of fascination, because as the reader, you're always, or as the viewer rather, you're always wondering what he's going to do. You never quite know what's going to happen, but you do know that something is going to happen. So, whenever I'm developing characters, I really try to make sure that, I want to just let me mic, cheers. Do you need the slide thing? Welcome. Yeah, so whenever I'm developing characters, I try to just literally list out the different contradictions that are happening within them. So my character might be really brave in certain circumstances, but then around certain other people, they just crumble and they become utterly cowardly. And listing out these different contradictions tends to build a really interesting character. And for me, the goal is, with my main characters, I want to be trying to get to 5 or 6 of these different contradictions so that there's all these different internal conflicts bouncing around in their heads. The third thing is 5 questions that I picked up from this really good book written by K.M. Wyland a few years ago. And these 5 questions are more useful for minor characters when you want to develop them, but you don't want to spend a ton of time on this person who might only be in 1 or 2 scenes. The first question to consider this is, what is your character's ghost? What is this traumatic event in their backstory or something that they fear which will motivate them to take action in the story? So, for instance, that might be the character was abandoned, or the character failed a mission, or something of that nature. And it's this ghost that is going to motivate them to take action within the narrative. The second thing is this idea of what the character wants. So this is the thing that the character believes will be good for themselves. But throughout the story, they might discover that this is different to the third thing, which is what they actually need. So what they need is usually different to what they want. So they might want $100 million, but what they might actually need is to find peace within themselves, or to integrate some aspects of their personality that are warring. Similar to this idea of the want and need being a bit different is this question of what is the lie the character believes at the beginning of the story, and what is the truth that they come to realize at the end? Or if you're writing a tragedy, what is the truth that they ignore at the end of the story? And these 5 questions really give you a good understanding of how the character is going to change from the start of the narrative to the end, because you're setting them up with this lie that they believe, which is giving them a flawed view of the world, and this want that they think is going to make their lives better. And then at the end of the narrative, they've either moved towards understanding a certain truth about themselves, might be a painful one, but it's a truth nonetheless, and they've also figured out what they actually need to move them forward. So those are the 3 first things in that 4 kind of tools that I think about when I'm developing characters. The last one ties it all together, because so far I've just talked about how these characters are in isolation. But characters, of course, aren't in isolation. Books are about a cast of characters. And I often refer to this as the character web, because it reflects my belief that all the characters in your story should sort of interweave with each other, and that their different views on the world and their different goals should conflict with each other in such a way that all of these characters are reflecting different aspects of your story's theme. So for instance, in a story about redemption, you might have the main character who doesn't think it's possible. You might have a secondary character who offers an alternative view, saying that instead it is possible, this is how I did it for myself. You might have a third character who says, it's definitely not possible at all, someone who's sort of in between that, and then all of these different characters give you unique perspectives on the theme in such a way that they influence the character's own opinions of the world. So there are of course way more things to think about when it comes to character, but I think for me, this idea of thinking about the character's goals, thinking about contradiction as a way to build complexity for them, thinking about those 5 questions of what is their ghost that haunts them, their want that they think will make them better, their need that they actually require, their lie and their truth, and then lastly considering how they all interweave with the other characters. For me, I've found that in the couple of books that I've written, that's been the most reliable process to creating characters that I found fascinating to explore, and readers have generally found fascinating as well. Alright, so now, the book, what we're all here for. The Thunder Heist is the first book in what is going to be a series that I plan to spend the next couple of years writing. It's about a relentless thief who undertakes this impossible heist to steal a device that channels energy from lightning to power a city. The whole thing is set in the world of the Twisted Seas, where humanity lives on these floating cities made from thousands of boats that rest on this monster-infested ocean. So I'm going to read to you a little excerpt from the first chapter of this. Our main character is called Kef Cutmark, and we open with her trapped in a prison. Chapter 1. Black Rake Prison. Kef Cutmark opened her eyes. Well, that's a damn disappointment. In the cage next to hers, metal creaked as Gerald rolled over. Talking about yourself? Talking about today. Thought it would feel special. Not every day you get executed. Kef pushed herself up into a squat, yawning, then raked her fingers through her tangled, salt-matted hair to scratch the back of her neck. Damn vermin were crawling all over Black Rake Prison, and the bugs were pretty bad, too. She stretched, if you could call it a stretch, when you were all folded up in a cage without room to stand. Her joints popped. She rolled her neck, easing out the kinks, while the floor swayed beneath her from the waves crashing against the ship's hull. Last night, they'd pulled her out of the windowless cell below decks in the ship's belly. That was a pity, because she'd finally scrounged enough contraband playing cards to set up an illegal gambling den, right in the shadowy back corner that was either the perfect place to get shanked or the best spot to sleep. After pulling her from the cell, they'd shoved her into a cage more fit for a dog than a woman. She'd gone quietly, not like the other prisoners. They'd all done their pathetic best to prolong the moment, which was a stupid move, because it just meant they'd spend their last hours with bruises and broken bones. Still, Kef wasn't like the others. On a ship where everyone was desperate to delay their death, everyone was still wondering why she'd persuaded the guards to move her execution forward. With Kef pressed up against the bars, they'd wheeled her cage along rusted metal walkways. Whenever the wheels hit a bump, the cage rattled hard enough to make Kef worry about losing a tooth. They slid her onto a platform, and then a wheezing scissor lift elevated her onto the ship's main deck, where a crane lifted the cage to slot Kef's prison into a metal scaffold. That was where she was now. Locked in a cage, dozens of condemned prisoners stacked around her, most in various degrees of concussion from their failed struggles last night. The sun's pale light inched over the distant horizon, flickering as waves chopped across the sea. Several miles west of Black Rake Prison, the sharp, rocky blades of the Spear Reef glistened red in the early morning glow, like tusks bathed in blood. As she squinted at the reef, a gust of wind dampened her cheeks with sea spray. She tasted salt on her tongue. To the east, joined to Black Rake Prison by a long anchor, Ardmouth was waking to a new day. Like the other city ships that sailed around the twisted seas, Ardmouth was made from lashed-together boats, ranging from huge tankers to tiny shanty vessels, which were more rust than metal. Living on a floating city could be hard, but with the land around the twisted seas dominated by monsters who'd kill you before you could take 3 steps out of the water, even the scrappiest dinghy in the dirtiest city ship was preferable. Saying that, plenty of monsters infested the seas, too. They were just slightly easier to deal with, although that depended on where you were. Most city ships, including Ardmouth, drifted around the Fordale Gulf, where monsters were smaller and less aggressive. But if you sailed through a place like the Dead Corvarsons, you'd be lucky to reach the other side, without a leviathan swallowing your vessel. Hundreds of miles of chains crisscrossed Ardmouth, linking the boats and spreading out far under the water, a defense against pirates and sea monsters. On the decks of the tallest ship, a crowd of well-dressed civilians had gathered, all babbling excitedly and looking through binoculars at Black Rake Prison. Kef snorted. One woman's death was another's breakfast entertainment. Soon, they'd probably let the rich bastards execute prisoners themselves. Nice sunrise, at least, Kef said. Do you ever shut up? Gerald asked from the cage beside her. We're about to die, and you're going on about the bloody view. Kef turned to raise an eyebrow at her neighbour. He was hunched in a miserable ball, looking small and damp. When they tossed her into jail last week, she'd barely had time to fix her hair before Gerald tried to grope her. She smirked. How are the fingers? Gerald scowled down at his hands. His makeshift splints couldn't disguise how his thumb now looked like it had 4 knuckles. Annoyingly enough, when she'd broken them, he'd only grown more infatuated with her, but in an irritating, puppy dog way. She supposed he'd been useful to remove corpses from the best mattresses, but mostly he'd made her wish she'd snuck earplugs into the prison ship. Thankfully, getting pulled up to the decks for his execution seemed to have tempered his more annoying habits. Funny how death's presence had that effect. And by the way, Keft leaned back against the bars, watching the pale sun crawl out of the water. Not to get too philosophical about it, because I know it might explode your tiny brain, but this seems like the perfect time to appreciate the sunrise. It's the last one you'll ever see. Gerald scoffed. And yours, too. Keft smiled. Sure. And that is our excerpt. Alrighty, so we're going to have about 20 minutes, or however long we go for, of Q&A. So if you have any questions about the book, or about the things I mentioned in my little TED talk at the start, feel free to fire away. And then after that, we'll be able to come up here, and if you want to grab copies of the books, be able to do that. I'll be signing them as well. Yeah, so any questions? Yes, now.
Jed, when you're writing a book with a view to having ongoing follow-ups, do you have to keep that very much in mind as to how you're going to complete this one, but leave it open enough to move it to another?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question there was, when I'm writing the first book in a series, how do I plan that in such a way that I can set up the future books? Probably the first step is to make sure that I don't... Actually, I won't say that, that's a bit of a spoiler. You've usually got to have some people left alive at the end of the book, if you want to keep writing about the characters. If you've read some of my previous books, you'll know I'm not always great at doing that. Having said that, I have read great sequels that did have none of the main characters left alive, or not followed at all. I think the biggest thing is showing readers that you're capable of doing a satisfying beginning, middle, and end with the first book, while still leaving some threads that you can pull on in the future. So, I think a lot of fantasy authors in particular, like, you know, your George R. R. Martin's, not to throw any shade at him, do struggle with wrapping up their series, and you can kind of see that this is going to be an issue from the first books in the series, where first book of A Song of Ice and Fire, it's a fantastic book, I really enjoyed it, but it doesn't really end. It just sort of has this great beginning, amazing middle, and then it's like, and there's going to be more middle coming on in the future. And for some readers, that's amazing, but for me personally, I really like to be able to show people who are going to experience the book that, hey, I can at least do an ending, so there's hopefully some trust going forward in terms of, you know, you've seen me deliver this ending before, I'm going to be able to do that again at the end of the series. I think the biggest thing is having different arcs that you're going to explore in each book. So the first book might be about a character struggling with one aspect of their personality, and then at the end of the book they've maybe achieved success with integrating that into them, or they have failed, and then in other books you can explore kind of different aspects of them. But mostly I think it's just about like not forcing it, and being aware that like if there's potential for a sequel or whatever, you're probably going to know it like before you start writing, because particularly with this world, like it just felt extremely expansive for me, and I wasn't able to kind of like capture all of the things I wanted to in the first book. So yeah, I suppose that's some of the things I consider with writing this. Yeah. Yeah.
This is the first book where you really used illustrations and drawings.
Yes.
And I know that they're integral to the story. Why was it for you, like, you had to have illustrations? Why is it important to the reader?
Yeah, so the question was, this is the first book with illustrations. What was the reasoning behind that? I think I really enjoy fantasy books that have a great sense of immersion in the world, and there's a lot of books out there at the moment that are having incredible interior illustrations that really make me feel like this isn't just this sort of like paper-thin facade that the characters are walking past in the background, but rather that this is this like vivid and three-dimensional landscape that you could walk down any street and it's going to be just as well realized around the corner as it is down the main street of wherever you are. Yeah, so if you haven't seen it already, there's like a couple of different pieces of art in here, and you're welcome to come up and have a closer look at them before. Maps of the Twisted Seas, maps of Black Wraith Prison, which was from that chapter we were just reading. But yeah, I think I really wanted to, and this actually comes back to the first question about like developing a series. I wanted to really give an idea that this world was so much more expansive than just one person's journey through it, that there were all these different aspects to it that could be stories in their own rights, but you're just seeing snippets of them because this person's path is not necessarily going through it. So yeah, it was just, I think, really important to me to have that sense of immersion in it, and particularly because there are some scenes where it is useful to know the kind of the plans of where the characters are moving through. Kind of like in that opening scene on Black Wraith Prison, you get a map of the prison so that you can sort of see the layout of it, and so when things start happening later, you have something to refer to. So yeah, it's just mostly that immersion, giving a sense that this world is really big, and then also the kind of pragmatic aspect of making sure that readers like understand where everything is. Yeah, great question. Anyone else? Yes?
How is your planning different when writing a series compared to writing a single book? Or...
Yeah, so how is the planning different? I think it is actually, I'm sort of running into the issue of that now, because with writing the first book, I was like, oh, this isn't that different to, you know, writing any other book that I've done before. But now sort of writing the second book in the series, which I'm about a quarter of the way into, although I haven't worked on it for a bit, I'm realizing that it is way trickier than I thought it would be, because it's very easy in the first book to just do a throwaway line of like, oh, and this is how this part of the world is or whatever. And then I've got to remember that in the future, and I'm like, oh, it'd be really convenient if I didn't have, let's say, radio in this book, but I established it in this thing. So now I've got to consider how that kind of interplays into it. So I guess it is making sure that I don't put anything into the books that's going to like break future stories. And to that end, I have like a rough sort of outline of how I want the next, say, 5 or 6 books in this series to go, with a sort of vague idea of how I would like to wrap up the series, but I could do that wrap up at like any sort of point in the series, if that makes sense. So I think that was important for my own planning process, is to like sort of know how I want it to end, but to know that like it can take like a couple of different journeys to get to that point. So yeah, I think it's mostly just like doing brief like sort of paragraph descriptions of what's going to happen in future books, so that I don't establish anything that's going to break those, and then also having a rough idea of like when I want to start like closing this up, how to go about that. Yeah. I think, did you have a
Yes,
question?
I did.
Yeah.
You did a great job, by the way,
Oh,
Jeff.
thanks.
My question was about the ending.
Mm.
Do you know right now what the ending is going to be?
Of the whole series?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't like fully know, but I have a rough idea of the things that I want to happen for it, and probably like a couple of different variations on how that goes. Yeah. But I am certainly open to like that changing as I continue exploring the world and the characters, and I would quite enjoy it to morph from what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably will. Well,
Yes.
Jim, as an author, the introduction of a character that seemingly is important, but he just flashes in and out of the story, is that used just as filling, or is it part of a build-up that he may come back in again, or she may come back in again?
Have you read this book?
Not yet.
The question was, how do I sort of deal with introducing a character who's going to be important in the future, but is just in this briefly now? Yeah, like, I don't know what chapter it is. There's literally one of those in the book towards the end, where there's a character who's going to be very important in future books in this series, who you are just aware of from one chapter. I think what was important with that, and like, you know it when you get to it as well, so I won't give names or anything away. What was important with that was just sort of making them like very different, and trying to like give you an understanding that they're going to go on to do more important things in the future. So they kind of break a bit of the rules of things that have already been established. The other characters like don't really know how to react to them, and basically they just like, I think it's about building a high level of contrast between them and sort of the other characters in the scene. Yeah, that kind of freaked me out when you started talking about that. I was like, have I launched this book before? Has everyone already read this? It's a good question. Anything else? Yes, go.
So I know you have a very busy schedule. How did you go with fitting in writing, working, socialising, and everything else?
Yeah, I think with writing these days, because I'm currently working like 4 days a week at a playground design company, and then doing my writing in the morning. I think the big thing is just like scheduling out time to have sort of high focus on the writing. So I usually get up at about 5 or so, and then write for a few hours before going off to work. And that was difficult to sort of get into the routine, but now that it's there and it's like in my schedule all the time, it's quite easy to get it done. But yeah, I think I just care about writing too much to not do it. So it's sort of a case of like, because I have such a strong motivation to do it, I do have to think about how I want to schedule it in and everything, but it sort of just happens because like it's important to me. And yeah, I think that's like a big thing with anything that you want to do more of, is like having that strong why for, making you do this thing that is important. Yeah. Yes, Mitch. Sorry. You go, Marcy.
How do you go about developing and creating your world, especially, you've created 3 or 4 different worlds now, including Taco, where you've got this whole idea of what you want, different things to look like. Do you draw things out? Do you write things down? How do you then keep developing and going into that world when you're writing?
Cool, yeah. I love talking about world building, so thank you for the question. So the question was like, how do I sort of go about building a fantasy world? I think it comes back to, it comes back to having trained as an architecture student, the ability that gives you to create, in its sense, not a fictional world, but like one that is theoretically a real one. That sort of is the approach that I would use to develop worlds in fantasy settings, kind of. In the sense that that's sort of about like, what is your initial concept? What is the initial feeling that you want a person to feel when they walk in your building, or a reader to experience when they're going through your story? And then what are some things that could like create that feeling? So almost like working backwards from like, what do you want readers to be thinking and experiencing and feeling from the narrative? And then like, how can you create those things? So if you want readers to feel uneasy and you're creating some sort of dystopian thing, then maybe that leads to you having lots of like surveillance systems in, or lots of like soldiers walking around or something like that. But I think for most of the fantasy books I've written, it's really just like mashing up a bunch of things that I love having in stories that I haven't necessarily seen together before. So like with the Thunder Heist, for instance, the world is like sort of got pirates in, but it's also got essentially like superheroes with wings, people who can breathe underwater, other types of mutants. It's also got like guns, and it's in a more sort of industrialized setting, which a lot of fantasy books aren't. And then there's just like sea monsters, and it's basically just a collection of like, how many different ideas can I throw into this soup? And then hopefully something can come out of that that will taste all right. Yeah. That's a great question. Mitch, do you have one?
This sounds like for flotilla-based societies is quite a unique concept. Is there any particular research or things that you looked into to really help you capture the essence of what that is? Did you live on a boat for 2 weeks?
So the question there is, did I do any research into like how a boat-based, that sounds like a good word, boat-based society would sort of function? I wish I could tell you that I had like lived on some medieval sailing yacht for 6 months, but I didn't. No, I think, yeah, it's mostly just like, to some extent, almost not caring hugely about the realism of it. I would like to think that like it does feel fleshed out and realistic and everything, but like I would prefer a story where it's a little bit unrealistic, but it's more fun, rather than something that's like, we're going to realistically have characters take 3 months to get from this location to this location, and we're going to tell you about every single day of walking on that journey. But Wikipedia, great resources for this. I think the big ones are like Wikipedia and just like searching images of various ships to get a sense of like, how big are these things? Like, if I wanted to have this number of people on this particular cargo ship, is it big enough for that? And then looking it up, wow, those are way bigger than I thought they were. Oh, like I've now spent an hour researching how cargo crates are stacked in a ship. That's super useless, but might be useful at a quiz night or something. Yeah, so it's just a combination of like because I know some authors that definitely go deep into research and like learn how to build their own swords and stuff like that. Like I think Christopher Paolini did that for Aragon. He like learned blacksmithing so that he could actually figure out how these swords were made, which I totally admire, and like I wish I had the time and resources to do that. But mostly it is just doing the best I can, and then if I need to, like as I'm going along, quickly just checking like how does this sizing work, and yeah, that sort of thing. It's a great question. Yes, Jack.
I'm sure you're aware there are entire sections of the internet that exist mocking men who attempt to write women doing it for them.
Sure.
How do you avoid that? And also, is that important to you to have a female characterization?
Yeah, okay, so the question was how did I write a female character without like hopefully stuffing it up too much? Well, I mean, you haven't read it all yet, so I might not have done a good job. I think it helped a fair bit, if you don't mind me embarrassing you, Beck, having my editor, Beck, over here, being female. So that like was useful to sort of, I don't know if that was much of a thing that we discussed in editing that much. It was a few months ago now. But I think it was useful because if there were things that I like maybe presented a bit weirdly or whatever, or that different to how that perspective would actually be, it was useful to have someone who like had actually lived that, so could pick that stuff up. I think particularly in fantasy books, there's just like a ton of sort of male-dominated fantasy, and like that's all right, but I guess I just wanted to do something that felt a little bit more unique and more original, I suppose. And yeah, I just guess there's like not a huge amount of representation of sort of like women in fantasy. I mean, if you think about Lord of the Rings, I can't really name, like it's a great series, I love it, but there's like, you're the expert here, right? There's like 3 women in the whole series, and there's, what, hundreds of characters in it. So yeah, it's not like a fantastic depiction of equality in it or whatever. I also think that in fantasy, for some reason, there's this weird idea that like, oh, you're allowed to have people who can like throw fireballs, or you can have like dragons or whatever, but it's like unrealistic to have female characters who are doing the same thing as male characters, and that doesn't really sit too well with me. So yeah, I just kind of like try to have a roughly equal distribution of characters in terms of like gender and that sort of thing. So yeah. Yes?
This is probably just building off a couple other questions you've had, but what have you seen as the benefits of kind of injecting a bit more of your own personality and press outside of writing into your work? So for example, putting illustrations in your books, have that architecture background, and just kind of putting stuff in outside of your writing interests.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, it is certainly like, I think like every author should be trying to draw on the things that make them, sorry, I'll just repeat the question quickly. It was, correct me if I say this wrong, how did I go about, or why did I want to inject like a lot of stuff outside of my writing life into the book, so architecture, illustrations, that sort of thing. Yeah, I think every author should be trying to draw upon the things that make them unique, because to me, stories are sort of like about giving readers a blend of the familiar and then also the strange. So you try to strike that balance by like the familiar, okay, everyone sort of knows what pirates are. A lot of people have read or watched a heist movie before, but then the strange is like, are they going to pick up my book and enjoy this book compared to the other books that are out there on heist stuff? And yeah, I think it's just coming down to trying to like blend more unique stuff into it. There's so many books out there. I think there's something like 8 million books on Amazon at the moment, or something crazy like that, and literally like thousands of them are getting published every day. So yeah, it is really, I think, just trying to like offer something unique, and also wanting to read the kind of thing that I would like to read. Like I was reading a book recently, The Shadow Saint by Gareth Hanrahan, and there's a character in it who's like into architecture history, and I was like, I hated this character in book 1, but now that it's book 2 and we're in their perspective and they're talking about different architectural periods, I really like them and I've realized that they're me. So I think it's about like trying to offer the thing that I would like to read in the books. I think we have time for maybe one more question quickly before we wrap up. So does anyone else have anything? Yes?
How many hours of writing did it take for this book?
Less than other books, weirdly. I started writing this probably about, we're up to now, maybe about 7 months ago or something like that. So it's been a lot quicker than a lot of my other books, I guess. I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact hours, but it would be like hundreds, if not thousands. Yeah, I do track a lot of the hours that I spend writing in like spreadsheet, mostly just for my own motivation, where I track like word count and hours and everything. So yeah, I could add that up and check, but I'm sure it would be several hundred, maybe a few thousand. So, yeah. All right, thanks everyone for your questions. What we're going to do now is, if you want to buy a copy of the book, you can come up here. Where's Dad? Dad is the salesperson today, so his commission isn't too high, don't worry. So you can come up here, it's $20 for a paperback or $30 for a hardback. Some people have already pre-ordered them, so I've got your names on your copies of the book. And then once you bought a copy, Dad will slide over here, I'll sign it, and if you want like a personalised message, or if you want me to just write something random in there, I can do that too. One other thing as well is, I think you should have like the sticky notes for this. When you get a copy of the book, if you can just like write your name down on it and then put it on the book so that I don't like misspell your name, you know, or anything like that. Even if I know you well, like it's just easier if everyone does that. There's a lot of words and stuff to keep track of, and I'm not a very good speller. That's what my editor's for. So yeah. All right, and yeah, you're more than welcome to have more food. Otherwise, yeah, we've got to be out of here at about 2:30 or so. So we'll probably spend the next 20 minutes doing this stuff. You're more than welcome to come up, chat, ask questions, get more food, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming.